In the high-pressure environment of a cockpit emergency, pilots develop a unique language that combines technical precision with remarkable emotional control. This specialized communication becomes their lifeline when facing disaster, allowing them to convey critical information while maintaining the calm needed to handle the situation. What most people don't realize is that these professionals are trained to speak in a controlled cadence even when staring death in the face. Their voices often betray no hint of the chaos unfolding around them. This disciplined communication isn't just protocol. It's a psychological tool that helps them focus on solutions rather than succumbing to panic. The recording from Eastern Airlines Flight 401 demonstrates this perfectly, where the captain methodically worked through checklists while dealing with catastrophic system failures, his voice remaining steady despite the dire circumstances. What's truly fascinating is how these cockpit recordings reveal the human element behind the uniform. Behind the technical jargon and procedural language, you can detect subtle shifts in tone that tell a deeper story about what's happening in those final moments. Aviation experts who analyze these recordings can identify the exact moment when a pilot realizes the situation might be unrecoverable, yet continues to fight for control without alarming the crew or passengers. This psychological battle, maintaining professional composure while processing the reality of imminent danger, represents one of the most profound examples of human performance under extreme pressure. Former military pilot Colonel James Harwick notes that this ability to compartmentalize fear is what separates exceptional aviators from the rest, allowing them to remain functional when primitive instincts would normally take over. The black box recordings often reveal a phenomenon aviation psychologists call tactical tunneling, where pilots in crisis situations focus intensely on solving immediate problems while sometimes missing broader contextual clues. This cognitive narrowing can sometimes lead to tragedy, as was the case with Air France Flight 447, where the pilots became fixated on conflicting airspeed readings while losing awareness of their aircraft's attitude. What makes these recordings so valuable isn't just their technical content, but what they teach us about decision-making under extreme stress. The industry has used these insights to revolutionize cockpit resource management training, emphasizing the importance of maintaining situational awareness even when immediate alarms demand attention. This balance between focused problem-solving and broader awareness represents one of the greatest challenges pilots face during emergencies. What's rarely discussed outside aviation circles is how pilots develop an almost sixth sense for trouble, something evident in many cockpit recordings where pilots detect subtle abnormalities before instruments confirm problems. Listen carefully to United Airlines Flight 232's recordings, and you'll hear Captain Al Haynes notice something not quite right in the engine sound nearly 40 seconds before any warning lights appeared. This intuitive awareness, developed through thousands of flight hours, often manifests in the recordings as casual observations that quickly escalate into life-or-death situations. Aviation safety expert Dr. Elena Kazan describes this as experiential pattern recognition, where pilots subconsciously process countless variables and detect deviations before conscious awareness. And as we'll see in our next section, this intuitive expertise becomes even more crucial when dealing with catastrophic mechanical failures, where standard procedures no longer apply. When critical aircraft systems begin to fail, the true test of piloting skill emerges. Beyond procedures and checklists lies the realm of improvisation and raw skill. What's astonishing about many cockpit recordings is hearing how quickly pilots transition from normal operations to creative problem-solving when facing unprecedented situations. The recordings from United Flight 232 capture Captain Al Haynes and his crew inventing an entirely new way to fly their crippled DC-10 after losing all hydraulic systems, something simulators had deemed impossible to survive. Their calm collaboration, using only differential engine thrust to control a massive airliner, resulted in saving 185 lives in what should have been a completely unsurvivable situation. The ingenuity displayed in these moments reveals how the best pilots combine technical knowledge with creative thinking under unimaginable pressure. What separates legendary pilots from merely competent ones becomes starkly evident in these crisis recordings. Their ability to rapidly process incomplete information and make decisions with life hanging in the balance. When British Airways Flight 9 flew through volcanic ash, causing all 4 engines to fail simultaneously, Captain Eric Moody's recorded voice remains remarkably composed as he works through restart procedures while simultaneously planning for a ditching at sea. The recordings reveal his methodical approach while facing what appeared to be certain disaster, prioritizing tasks and maintaining command presence despite the overwhelming nature of the emergency. Aviation psychologist Dr. Robert Sumner notes that this cognitive flexibility, the ability to abandon familiar patterns when they no longer apply, represents the highest level of expertise in any high-risk profession. What truly stands out in cockpit recordings during catastrophic failures is how crew dynamics either amplify or undermine chances of survival. The recordings often reveal a complex dance of assertiveness and collaboration, where effective crews establish clear command while remaining open to critical information from all sources. Tragically, in the case of Air Florida Flight 90, the black box captured a textbook example of communication breakdown. The first officer noticed critical ice buildup before takeoff, but failed to assertively communicate his concerns to the captain. This hierarchical barrier, where junior crew members hesitate to challenge authority figures, has been identified as a contributing factor in numerous accidents. Modern aviation training now specifically addresses this authority gradient, teaching crews to establish psychological safety where life-saving observations can be shared regardless of rank. The most haunting aspect of these recordings is hearing how quickly routine flights transform into desperate fights for survival. One moment, pilots are discussing mundane topics like weather and fuel consumption. Moments later, they're engaged in extraordinary battles to save their aircraft and everyone aboard. The recording from Qantas Flight 32, where an A380's engine catastrophically disintegrated, captures this jarring transition as casual cockpit conversation instantly shifts to intense crisis management. What makes these moments so powerful is hearing human beings rise to challenges they never imagined facing, displaying a level of performance that exceeds what they likely believe themselves capable of. And as we'll explore next, this remarkable human capacity becomes even more evident when pilots face not just mechanical failures, but active sabotage or deliberate attacks on their aircraft. When pilots suddenly find themselves under deliberate attack, the recordings reveal a different dimension of aviation courage, one where defending the aircraft becomes as important as flying it. The cockpit voice recorder from Air Rhodesia Flight 825, targeted by surface-to-air missiles in 1978, captured Captain John Weatherall's extraordinary calm as he simultaneously attempted to outmaneuver the incoming threat while broadcasting precise position information to ground stations. What's remarkable in these recordings is how quickly military-trained civilian pilots access combat mindsets, prioritizing threats and executing defensive maneuvers while maintaining awareness of their primary responsibility to passengers. Former Air Force pilot Colonel Richard Bartlett notes that this seamless transition between civilian and combat mentality represents perhaps the most difficult psychological shift any professional can make. Yet the recordings show pilots making this transition in mere seconds. What's particularly striking about cockpit recordings during attack scenarios is how pilots maintain focus despite the overwhelming emotional impact of realizing they're being deliberately targeted. The recording from Korean Airlines Flight 007, shot down by Soviet interceptors in 1983, reveals Captain Chun Byung-in's disciplined approach as he simultaneously attempted diplomatic communications while executing evasive maneuvers. The recordings show how he compartmentalized the shock and outrage of being fired upon without warning, instead channeling all cognitive resources toward survival. Aviation security expert Michael Reynolds describes this as tactical emotional regulation, the ability to process profound threat without allowing emotional responses to degrade performance. This emotional discipline becomes even more apparent when pilots face the most challenging scenario imaginable: an attack from within their own aircraft. When hijackers breach cockpit security, the recordings reveal perhaps the most complex scenarios pilots can face, balancing compliance to protect passengers with subtle resistance to minimize threat. The partial recordings from Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961, hijacked in 1996, demonstrate Captain Lullabate's remarkable strategy of apparent cooperation while subtly positioning his aircraft for the best possible ditching scenario when fuel exhaustion became inevitable. What emerges from these recordings is evidence of extraordinary psychological sophistication as pilots navigate complex human dynamics while maintaining technical control of their aircraft. Former hostage negotiator Dr. Sarah Kleinman notes that these pilots essentially perform simultaneous roles as aviator, negotiator, and tactician, requiring a breadth of skill far beyond normal operational requirements. Their recorded interactions reveal careful word choices and communication strategies that aim to de-escalate volatile human threats while preserving options for survival. The most heart-wrenching cockpit recordings come from scenarios where pilots recognize that their aircraft has been commandeered for use as a weapon. The fragmentary recordings from United Airlines Flight 93 on September 11th reveal the crew's dawning realization of what was happening, followed by their determination to prevent their aircraft from reaching its intended target. What makes these recordings so powerful is hearing ordinary professionals transition into extraordinary heroes, making the conscious decision to sacrifice themselves rather than become unwilling participants in mass murder. Aviation historian Thomas Mitchell describes these recordings as testaments to the human capacity for moral clarity under the most extreme duress, showing how pilots' sense of responsibility extends far beyond the technical operation of their aircraft. And as we'll examine next, this profound sense of duty becomes even more evident when pilots face nature's most violent forces. When aircraft encounter extreme natural phenomena, cockpit recordings reveal a primal contest between human ingenuity and nature's raw power. The recording from Boise Flight 911, which encountered catastrophic clear air turbulence near Mount Fuji in 1966, captures Captain Bernard Dobson's stunned realization as unprecedented G-forces began tearing the aircraft apart, followed by his immediate action to try stabilizing what remained of the airframe. What stands out in these recordings is how quickly pilots transition from routine operations to survival mode when confronting the atmosphere's most violent manifestations. Meteorologist and pilot Dr. Catherine Chun explains that these encounters represent physics at its most unforgiving, where pilots must instantly grasp complex aerodynamic principles as their aircraft behaves in ways never covered in standard training. The recordings reveal pilots making split-second calculations about structural limits as they attempt to navigate through forces powerful enough to rip wings from fuselages. What's particularly fascinating in cockpit recordings during severe weather encounters is hearing how pilots integrate technical knowledge with intuition when instruments become unreliable or provide contradictory information. The recordings from Southern Airways Flight 242, which flew through a thunderstorm so intense it destroyed both engines, reveal Captain Bill McKenzie flying by feel as hail shattered the windscreen and disabled most instruments. The recordings capture his transition from reliance on technology to fundamental piloting skills, using physical sensations and visual cues to maintain control while descending through zero visibility conditions. Aviation instructor Captain James Rowland describes this as returning to aviation's first principles, when pilots must discard layers of technological dependency and connect directly with their aircraft's basic flight characteristics. This ability to mentally strip away complexity and focus on core flying principles often determines survival when nature overwhelms technology. The most technically impressive cockpit recordings come from pilots battling sudden wind shear events, invisible aerial ambushes that have claimed countless aircraft. The recording from Delta Flight 191 captures the crew's desperate struggle against a microburst that pushed their approaching aircraft toward the ground with tremendous force. What makes these recordings so valuable is hearing the rapid-fire decision-making as pilots must simultaneously diagnose the phenomenon, calculate its magnitude, and execute the precise countermaneuver, often contradicting basic instincts and standard procedures. Former NTSB investigator Robert Thompson notes that these recordings have been instrumental in developing the standardized wind shear escape maneuver now taught to all pilots, requiring maximum power while maintaining a precise pitch attitude, regardless of sink rate warnings. The recordings reveal how pilots must override both emotional responses and certain warning systems to execute the counterintuitive actions necessary for survival. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing cockpit recordings come from flights that encounter prolonged battles with the elements, where pilots must maintain peak performance not for seconds or minutes, but for hours under extreme stress. The recording from Air Canada Flight 143, which ran out of fuel due to a metric conversion error, captures Captain Robert Pearson's extraordinary 3-hour glide after both engines failed at 41,000 feet. The recording reveals how he managed mental fatigue and maintained decision-making quality throughout the ordeal, rationing his cognitive resources and delegating tasks to preserve his capacity for the critical final approach. Performance psychologist Dr. Elena Markov points to this recording as evidence of stress inoculation in action, where previous training and experience create mental pathways that remain accessible even under extreme conditions. And as we'll discover in our next section, this psychological resilience becomes even more crucial when pilots must manage both technical emergencies and responsibility for passengers' lives. What separates routine emergencies from aviation's most defining moments is when pilots must make impossible choices, decisions where all options involve terrible risk. The cockpit recording from United Airlines Flight 173 captures Captain Malbin McBroom's fateful decision-making as he circled Portland with landing gear problems, focusing so intently on the technical issue that he missed critical fuel warnings. What makes this recording particularly valuable is hearing how cognitive tunneling can affect even experienced commanders, the gradual narrowing of attention that blinds them to emerging threats. Aviation psychologist Dr. Martin Brenner uses this recording in training programs to demonstrate how stress reconfigures attention, noting that under pressure, we don't rise to the occasion. We fall to our highest level of preparation. The recording reveals how McBroom's fixation on one problem inadvertently created a much more serious emergency, highlighting the constant balance pilots must maintain between addressing immediate issues and maintaining broader situational awareness. The most ethically complex cockpit recordings involve moments when captains must decide whether to continue to their destination or divert to alternates. Decisions often complicated by commercial pressures, weather uncertainties, and incomplete information. The recording from Air Ontario Flight 1363 reveals Captain George Morwood's deliberation about taking off in snowfall with engines that couldn't use de-icing systems due to a known mechanical issue. What's striking is hearing his methodical risk assessment, weighing passenger inconvenience against safety margins, ultimately making a decision that proved catastrophic. Former accident investigator Captain James Reynolds describes these recordings as demonstrations of practical ethics under pressure, where theoretical safety principles collide with real-world constraints and human factors. These recordings show how easily sound decision-making can be undermined by subtle pressures, fatigue, or the natural human tendency to continue with established plans despite changing conditions. The recordings that most clearly reveal the burden of command are those capturing moments when captains must balance their professional obligation to passengers with their responsibility to crew members. The partial recording from Air France Flight 447 reveals the complex dynamics between three pilots trying to diagnose confusing instrument readings while the aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall over the Atlantic Ocean. What emerges from this recording is the profound challenge of leadership during ambiguous emergencies, when the captain must decide whether to assert authority or allow technical specialists to work through problems. Aviation leadership expert Captain Michael Sullivan notes that these recordings demonstrate how command authority isn't about knowing everything, but about creating conditions where collective expertise can function effectively. These moments reveal the delicate balance between decisive leadership and collaborative problem-solving that characterizes effective cockpit management during crises. Perhaps the most profound cockpit recordings are those capturing moments when pilots must acknowledge the possible end of their own lives while continuing to fight for survival. The recording from Japan Airlines Flight 123, which suffered catastrophic hydraulic failures, captures Captain Masami Takahama's extraordinary composure as he attempted to control an essentially unflyable aircraft while simultaneously preparing his crew for the worst possible outcome. What makes these recordings so moving is hearing how pilots maintain dignity and purpose even when facing likely death, continuing to execute their professional responsibilities until the very end. Former military aviation psychologist Dr. Thomas Wright describes this as the ultimate expression of the pilot ethos, persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. And as we'll explore in our final section, it's this unyielding determination that has transformed some of aviation's darkest moments into its most profound lessons. The true value of cockpit recordings lies not in their drama, but in their capacity to prevent future tragedies through brutally honest lessons. What makes these recordings so powerful as teaching tools is their unfiltered authenticity, capturing both technical details and human factors that contribute to accidents. The recording from United Airlines Flight 232 has become required study for airline pilots worldwide, demonstrating both the extraordinary skill that saved 185 lives and the small communication breakdowns that might have prevented the emergency entirely. Aviation safety expert Captain Robert Summerfield notes that these recordings transform individual tragedy into collective wisdom, allowing the entire profession to learn from experiences no training program could ethically replicate. Each recording becomes a sacred text of sorts, preserving lessons purchased at enormous cost and ensuring that sacrifices lead to genuine improvement rather than being forgotten. What's particularly remarkable about the evolution of aviation safety is how cockpit recordings have shifted training emphasis from technical proficiency to human factors and crew resource management. The recording from Eastern Airlines Flight 401, where the crew became fixated on a minor landing gear indicator problem while failing to notice their gradual descent into the Everglades, revolutionized how pilots are trained to manage attention and workload. This recording single-handedly transformed cockpit procedures, introducing concepts like sterile cockpit rules and explicit task management protocols now standard throughout the industry. Former FAA Safety Director Elizabeth Thornton describes these recordings as the aviation equivalent of case law, establishing precedents that guide future operations based on hard-earned experience. The willingness to learn from failure rather than hiding it represents one of aviation's most admirable cultural attributes, a commitment to truth that has made flying the safest form of transportation despite its inherent risks. The most technically influential cockpit recordings are those that reveal subtle design flaws or unexpected aircraft behaviors that might otherwise remain theoretical concerns. The recording from Air Inter Flight 148 exposed a critical interface design flaw in early A320 aircraft, where pilots could easily confuse vertical speed and flight path angle modes, a mistake that led the perfectly functioning aircraft directly into a mountainside. What makes these recordings invaluable is their demonstration of how even small ambiguities in human-machine interfaces can have catastrophic consequences under pressure. Aviation human factors specialist Dr. James Richardson points to dozens of cockpit designs that have been fundamentally improved based on insights from these recordings, from warning systems to display layouts to control logics. This willingness to critically examine and improve technology based on real-world evidence has created increasingly resilient systems that compensate for inevitable human limitations. The emotional power of cockpit recordings ultimately comes from their testament to the profound responsibility pilots accept every time they take command. When United Airlines Flight 93 passengers and crew fought back against hijackers on September 11th, the recording captured First Officer Leroy Homer's final professional actions alongside the passenger uprising, continuing to perform his duties even as the aircraft was being used as a weapon. What emerges from these most difficult recordings is evidence of aviation's highest value: the unwavering commitment to protect those entrusted to their care regardless of personal cost. Former NTSB investigator Catherine Rayner describes these recordings as profoundly human documents that reveal how ordinary professionals rise to extraordinary challenges. They remind us that behind the technical complexity and procedural discipline lies aviation's essential truth. Every flight represents an act of human trust, honored by pilots who accept responsibility for lives beyond their own. What we've uncovered today goes far beyond just technical details or dramatic final moments. We've glimpsed the true essence of what happens when ordinary professionals face extraordinary circumstances. These cockpit recordings don't just tell stories of disasters. They reveal the remarkable human capacity for courage, ingenuity, and unwavering commitment to duty. Think about what you've learned: how pilots maintain composure even when facing certain catastrophe, how they improvise solutions to impossible problems, and how they honor their responsibility to passengers until their final breath. Doesn't this change how you'll think about your next flight? About the men and women in that cockpit? These aren't just operators following checklists. They're guardians of an extraordinary tradition that transforms routine transportation into one of humanity's safest activities despite the inherent risks of defying gravity. Have you ever considered how these lessons from aviation's darkest moments might apply to your own life? The ability to maintain calm under pressure, to collaborate effectively during crisis, to balance technical expertise with human intuition. These aren't just pilot skills. They're universal human capacities we all can develop. What emergency in your life might benefit from the same disciplined approach these recordings reveal? What team dynamics could improve by applying cockpit resource management principles? The next time you face your own personal or professional crisis, remember the voice of Captain Al Haynes calmly working through impossible problems while maintaining his humanity and even occasional humor. That capacity for grace under pressure exists within you too. The black box doesn't lie. It captures our failures and triumphs with unflinching honesty. And in that honesty lies aviation's greatest strength: the commitment to learn from every mistake, to transform tragedy into protection for future passengers. This willingness to face hard truths has made flying extraordinarily safe despite the complex challenges involved. How might your life change if you approach your own mistakes with the same commitment to honest examination and genuine improvement? What personal black box might you need to review to prevent repeating patterns that lead to your own life's difficulties? The aviation industry has demonstrated that acknowledging failure isn't weakness. It's the foundation of true resilience and continual improvement. Perhaps that's the most valuable lesson these cockpit recordings offer us all. If you found these insights valuable, don't keep them to yourself. Share this video with someone who might benefit from understanding what really happens in those critical cockpit moments when everything is on the line. And if you want to dive deeper into aviation's most profound lessons, subscribe to our channel right now and activate notifications. We're just getting started with this exploration of extraordinary human performance under the most challenging conditions imaginable. What other aviation mysteries would you like us to investigate next? Let us know in the comments below. Until our next journey together, remember that behind every routine flight lies the extraordinary human capacity to rise to challenges we never imagined facing. Thank you for joining us today on this revealing exploration of aviation's most defining moments.